There is a particular kind of person you have probably encountered at some point in your life. Maybe it was a colleague, maybe a mentor, maybe someone you watched from a distance, trying to understand what exactly they were doing differently. On the surface, they didn't appear to be working harder than everyone else. They weren't the loudest voice in the room. They didn't seem to be scrambling the way the rest of the world was scrambling. And yet, when opportunities arrived, and they always seemed to arrive for this person, they were ready. Not just ready, they were positioned. As if they had known the opportunity was coming long before anyone else could see it on the horizon. You probably wrote it off as luck. Most people do. It's the easiest explanation and the most comfortable one, because luck implies randomness. And randomness means you couldn't have done anything differently. But here is what you didn't see. What you couldn't see. Underneath that calm, composed readiness was something that had been quietly built over months, sometimes years, before it was ever needed. A structure, a foundation, a set of invisible systems that had been designed, refined, and maintained long before the moment of opportunity ever arrived. This is the invisible edge, and almost nobody talks about it, because the people who have it rarely announce it. They don't post about it. They don't explain it in meetings. They simply operate from it, the way a master carpenter operates from years of practiced technique. Not thinking about every movement, just executing with a precision that looks to the untrained eye almost effortless. Here is the central question that this audiobook is going to explore. Why do some people seem to thrive in conditions that overwhelm everyone else? Not because they are smarter, not because they were born into better circumstances, but because they built something in advance. They built before the crisis, before the opportunity, before the moment when everyone else was forced to improvise. Consider what happened to the global supply chain in the early 2020s. Nearly every industry was caught off guard, executives were scrambling, prices exploded, timelines collapsed. Companies that had operated on lean, just-in-time inventory models, which had been celebrated for decades as the pinnacle of modern efficiency, suddenly found themselves with nothing to deliver and no way to recover quickly. But there were exceptions. Certain companies, certain leaders, had built what looked like redundant systems, backup suppliers, diversified logistics networks, deeper inventory buffers than the conventional wisdom recommended. They had been building these things not because they knew a pandemic was coming, but because they understood something fundamental about the nature of complex systems, that fragility accumulates quietly and resilience has to be constructed deliberately. When the disruption hit, these companies didn't just survive, they gained market share. They acquired customers from collapsed competitors. They hired the talent that the industry was suddenly shedding. They moved from a position of strength while everyone around them was moving from a position of desperation. That is the invisible edge in its most dramatic form, but it doesn't only operate at the scale of corporations, it operates in careers, in professional reputations, in the way individuals navigate power, influence, and opportunity. It operates in your decisions, in what you build today that you won't need until tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now. What makes this concept so counterintuitive is that it runs directly against one of the most deeply embedded instincts in modern professional culture. That instinct is this: respond to what is in front of you. Prioritize what is urgent. Optimize for now. We live in a world that rewards immediate output, quarterly results, daily metrics, weekly performance reviews. The incentive structures that govern most professional environments push people relentlessly toward the present. And so building something you don't immediately need feels in this environment almost irresponsible, almost indulgent. But here is what that instinct costs you. Every time a crisis arrives and you are not prepared, you spend an enormous amount of energy just returning to baseline. You fight fires. You manage chaos. You make reactive decisions under pressure, which are almost always worse decisions than the ones you would have made with time and clarity. And after all of that effort, after all of that scrambling, you don't end up ahead. You end up back where you started, exhausted and more behind than ever. The invisible edge is the answer to this cycle. And understanding how to build it, how to think about it, how to prioritize it, and how to maintain it over time, is what this audiobook is about. We are going to move through 10 interconnected ideas, not as abstract theories, but as practical frameworks for understanding why certain people consistently outperform, outposition, and outlast everyone around them. By the end, you won't just understand the invisible edge, you'll know exactly what yours should look like and why you should have started building it yesterday. There is a concept in engineering called a margin of safety. It is the difference between what a structure is designed to handle and what it is actually built to withstand. A bridge rated for 10,000 vehicles per day might be engineered to handle 30,000. Not because the designers expected 30,000 vehicles, but because they understood something that most people outside of engineering never fully internalize. The gap between expected conditions and actual conditions is almost always larger than anyone predicts. And when the unexpected arrives, a storm, an accident, a sudden surge in load, it is that invisible margin, that built-in excess capacity, that determines whether the structure holds or collapses. The most successful professionals in any field operate by a remarkably similar principle. They build margins into their lives long before those margins are needed. Not just financial margins, though those matter. Margins of skill, margins of relationship capital, margins of reputation, of trust, of prepared capacity. These are the invisible structures that nobody sees during ordinary times, and that become the decisive advantage when conditions stop being ordinary. The question is why more people don't build this way, and the answer, when you trace it carefully, is not laziness or lack of awareness. It is something far more subtle. It is a cognitive bias that behavioral economists call the planning fallacy, combined with a second bias that psychologists refer to as the availability heuristic. Together, these two forces create a kind of perceptual tunnel that keeps most intelligent, hard-working people trapped in a mode of perpetual reaction. The planning fallacy, first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s, describes our consistent tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take, how much they will cost, and how much can go wrong. We focus on the best-case scenario almost by default. We imagine smooth execution. We assume cooperation, favorable conditions, and our own full capacity to perform. This isn't wishful thinking in the naive sense. It's a deeply structural feature of how the human mind plans. We simulate the future from the inside, imagining ourselves doing the work, rather than from the outside, looking at the base rates of how similar projects have actually unfolded throughout history. The result is that we consistently underplan for disruption. We don't build the margin, we don't create the buffer. We assume the bridge will only ever carry 10,000 vehicles because that's all we've needed so far. The availability heuristic compounds this. We judge the probability of future events based on how easily we can recall similar events from our past. If you have never experienced a serious professional crisis, a layoff, a market collapse, a catastrophic project failure, your mind treats that crisis as relatively improbable because you have no vivid memory to make it feel real. But the absence of personal experience is not evidence of low probability. It is simply the record of what has happened to you so far. The world contains far more variation than any individual life can sample. What this means in practice is that most people build systems only after they've felt the pain of not having them. They create backup plans after the first plan has already failed. They develop new skills after they've lost a job that required skills they didn't have. They build relationships after they've discovered that the relationships they had weren't enough when it mattered. This is learning, certainly, but it is the most expensive form of learning possible because the tuition is paid in real consequences, in lost income, in missed opportunities, in professional setbacks that can take years to recover from. The people with the invisible edge have found a different way. They have trained themselves to learn from hypothetical pain rather than actual pain. They run what some strategists call pre-mortem analysis, a practice where you imagine, before beginning anything, that the project has already failed and then work backward to identify why. What went wrong? What wasn't built? What was missing when the moment of pressure arrived? This mental reversal does something remarkable. It bypasses the optimism bias that normally governs forward-looking planning and forces the mind to engage honestly with the possibility of failure, not as a threat to be deflected, but as a design problem to be solved in advance. The historian who studied this most rigorously wasn't a psychologist or an economist. It was a Roman emperor. Marcus Aurelius, who governed the most complex administrative system the ancient world had ever produced, wrote extensively in his private journals about the practice of negative visualization, imagining in detail what could go wrong, not to induce anxiety, but to prepare the mind to respond with clarity when difficulty arrived. He called it the discipline of assent, and he practiced it not occasionally but daily as a kind of cognitive maintenance for a life lived permanently in conditions of high uncertainty. Centuries later, the core insight remains intact. The systems you build before you need them are always built more carefully, more thoughtfully, and more effectively than the ones you build in crisis, because crisis compresses time, it narrows thinking, it forces shortcuts. And shortcuts in the architecture of a professional life have a way of becoming permanent structural weaknesses. In 1994, a relatively unknown executive at a large investment bank made a decision that his colleagues thought was, at best, eccentric, and at worst, a quiet form of professional self-sabotage. He was performing well. He had a clear trajectory, the kind of upward path that most people in his position would have protected carefully, avoiding any move that might introduce uncertainty or signal dissatisfaction. Instead, he resigned. He left a stable, lucrative position to start an online bookstore operating out of a garage in Bellevue, Washington. The idea was not, on its surface, obviously revolutionary. Books were already being sold, stores already existed, catalogs already existed. What could an online version offer that justified the risk of abandoning everything he had already built? What Jeff Bezos understood, and what his colleagues almost certainly did not, was that he wasn't just building a bookstore. He was building infrastructure, a logistics system, a customer trust architecture, a technology foundation. He was building things that would not reveal their full value for years, possibly decades. The bookstore was simply the first application of a much deeper system that he had already designed in his mind. And almost nothing about that system was visible to anyone watching from the outside. This is one of the most important and least discussed patterns among people who build lasting success. They are almost always building something larger than what they appear to be building. The visible project is rarely the real project. The real project is the underlying capability, the system, the network, the infrastructure of skill and relationship and operational capacity that the visible project is quietly constructing around itself. Think about what this means for the way most people approach their careers. The conventional model of professional development is essentially linear. You do your job, you do it well, you get recognized, you are promoted, you take on a larger version of the same job, you do that well, you get promoted again. The logic is sound as far as it goes, but it contains a critical hidden assumption that the environment in which you are performing will remain stable enough for that linear progression to continue uninterrupted. That the skills that made you valuable today will remain the skills that make you valuable in 3 years. That the relationships you have now will be sufficient for the opportunities that arrive later. History suggests, repeatedly and forcefully, that this assumption is wrong. Industries transform, technologies disrupt, economic conditions shift, organizational structures reorganize. The professional environment is not a stable ladder. It is, to borrow a metaphor from complexity theory, a constantly shifting landscape where the peaks that represent success today may become valleys tomorrow, and the paths that lead upward are always changing beneath your feet. The people who navigate this landscape most successfully are not the ones who climb the current peak most efficiently. They are the ones who are simultaneously building the capacity to navigate the next configuration of the landscape, even before they can see exactly what that configuration will look like. They develop what the organizational theorist David Teese called dynamic capabilities, not just the ability to perform current tasks well, but the ability to reconfigure, to adapt, to build new competencies as the environment demands them. But here is the insight that makes this actionable rather than merely abstract. Dynamic capability is not a talent you either have or don't have. It is a practice, and at the center of that practice is a specific habit of attention. The people who build successfully in advance are almost universally better than average at noticing weak signals, small shifts in their environment that most people dismiss as noise, a change in the language their industry uses, a new kind of problem appearing in client conversations, a technology being adopted at the periphery of their field that hasn't yet reached the center, a demographic shift in who is entering their profession. These are the early tremors that precede the earthquake, and they are only visible to people who have trained themselves to look for them. The science behind this kind of pattern recognition is worth understanding. Research in expert performance, particularly the work of Gary Klein on naturalistic decision-making, found that the most effective decision-makers in high-stakes environments, military commanders, firefighters, intensive care nurses, didn't make better decisions by analyzing more options. They made better decisions because they recognized patterns faster. Their experience had built a kind of perceptual library, a vast catalogue of situations and their consequences that allowed them to see what was happening before the data made it obvious to everyone else. This is not an ability reserved for people with 30 years of experience. It can be deliberately cultivated at any stage of a career, through a practice that is simple to describe and genuinely difficult to sustain. The practice is systematic reflection. Not the casual retrospective kind, not simply thinking about your day on the drive home, but structured, intentional analysis of what you are observing, what patterns are emerging, and what those patterns might be signaling about the future shape of your environment. The people who build before they need to are almost always people who have made this kind of reflection a non-negotiable part of how they operate. Not occasionally, not when things go wrong, consistently as a matter of discipline, regardless of how busy the present moment demands they be. Because the present moment will always make demands. And those demands will always feel more urgent than the quiet work of building for a future that hasn't arrived yet. That tension between what is urgent and what is important is not a scheduling problem. It is the central psychological challenge of building an invisible edge, and it requires a specific kind of thinking to resolve. There is a study that most people in competitive professional environments have never heard of, and it contains one of the most unsettling findings in the entire field of organizational psychology. It was conducted over a period of nearly 2 decades, following a large group of middle and senior managers across multiple industries. The researchers weren't tracking performance reviews or compensation trajectories. They were tracking something far more revealing: how these managers spent their discretionary time. The time that wasn't scheduled, the time that wasn't demanded by meetings or deliverables or direct reports, the hours that each person got to choose how to use. What they found was not surprising in its broad outline, but devastating in its specifics. The vast majority of managers, across industries, across seniority levels, across organizational cultures, spent their discretionary time on one of 2 things. Either they extended their existing work, doing more of what they were already paid to do, or they consumed information passively, reading industry news, attending conferences, absorbing content without any structured intention to apply it. A small minority, roughly 15% of the sample, did something categorically different. They used their discretionary time to build, to develop skills adjacent to their current role, to cultivate relationships outside their immediate professional circle, to experiment with new approaches, new tools, new frameworks, not because their current job required it, but because they were constructing capacity for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Over the 20-year span of the study, that 15% didn't just outperform the others. They outperformed them by a margin that the researchers themselves described as startling. They were more likely to be promoted, more likely to successfully transition when their industries changed, more likely to recover quickly from setbacks, more likely in every measurable dimension to sustain high performance across the full arc of their careers rather than peaking early and plateauing. The researchers called this pattern proactive capacity building. But the label, precise as it is, doesn't fully capture what was actually happening psychologically. Because this wasn't just a behavioral difference, it was a fundamentally different relationship with time itself. Most people, even highly ambitious ones, operate with what psychologists call a present tense orientation toward their professional lives. They assess their situation based on where they are now. They measure progress based on what has changed recently. They make investments based on what is immediately useful. This orientation is not irrational. It is, in fact, a perfectly sensible response to most incentive structures, which reward current performance far more visibly and immediately than future preparation. But it creates a specific kind of blindness. It makes the future feel abstract and distant right up until the moment it becomes the present, at which point it is, by definition, too late to prepare for it. The 15% in that study had, either deliberately or intuitively, developed what might be called a future tense orientation. They were running two timelines simultaneously in their minds. One timeline was the present, the current job, the current responsibilities, the current relationships and demands. The other timeline was a horizon, a projected version of where they were likely to be in 3 to 5 years and what that version of themselves would need in order to be effective. And they were building toward that horizon timeline every day in small increments, using whatever discretionary time they could protect. This dual timeline thinking is not a natural cognitive habit. It has to be constructed deliberately. And one of the clearest ways to understand how it works in practice is to look at how the most effective leaders think about skill development. Not for themselves, but for the people they lead. The best managers, the ones consistently described by their teams as transformational rather than merely competent, share a specific behavior. They don't just assign work based on current capability. They assign work that is slightly beyond current capability, calibrated to stretch people toward the skills they will need next. They are, in other words, building their team's future capacity in parallel with executing current objectives. The psychologist Lev Vygotsky called this operating in the zone of proximal development, the space just beyond what someone can do independently, where growth happens fastest. Great leaders are constantly holding this zone in mind for every person they work with, but the truly exceptional ones are holding it in mind for themselves as well. They are always asking, what is the next version of this role, this function, this industry going to demand? And am I building toward that now, or am I simply executing what is already required of me? This question sounds straightforward. In practice, it is remarkably difficult to hold consistently because the pressure of present performance is so relentless. There will always be a deliverable due, always a meeting that runs long, always a crisis that consumes the afternoon. The system of a modern professional life is optimized, almost perfectly, for producing present output at the expense of future capacity. And unless you build a deliberate counterstructure, a protected space, a consistent practice, a non-negotiable allocation of time and attention toward the horizon, the present will consume everything. What that counterstructure looks like varies by person, by role, by industry. But the underlying architecture is almost always the same. A specific time, protected from interruption, dedicated to building rather than executing. A specific question, asked regularly and honestly, am I building the capacity I will need or only performing the capacity I already have? And a specific tolerance for the discomfort of investing in things that don't pay off immediately. Because the entire logic of building before you need something is that the returns are always delayed, always invisible in the short term, and always disproportionate when they finally arrive. In the winter of 1941, a young naval officer named Chester Nimitz received one of the most daunting assignments in American military history. The attack on Pearl Harbor had decimated the Pacific Fleet. Morale was shattered, resources were depleted. The strategic situation was, by almost any honest assessment, catastrophic. And yet within 18 months, Nimitz had not only stabilized the Pacific theater, he had begun the systematic reversal of Japanese naval dominance that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Military historians have spent decades analyzing how he did it. The answers are complex and numerous, but one pattern emerges consistently across every serious account of his leadership. Nimitz spent an extraordinary amount of his time, even in the depths of crisis, building systems and structures that wouldn't be needed for months, training programs that wouldn't produce results for a year, logistics networks that wouldn't be fully operational until campaigns he couldn't yet name. He was, in the most literal sense, building before he needed to, in conditions that would have justified, by any conventional standard, focusing exclusively on what was directly in front of him. What Nimitz understood, and what most people in positions of pressure never fully grasp, is that a crisis is never the time to build foundational capacity. It is the time to draw on it. The crisis reveals what was constructed during the quiet periods. It exposes the strength or weakness of what was built when there was still time to build carefully. And if nothing was built, if the quiet periods were consumed entirely by the demands of the present, then the crisis finds you with nothing to draw on. Improvisation becomes the only option, and improvisation under genuine pressure is a profoundly unreliable strategy. This is the pattern that separates organizations that merely survive disruption from those that emerge from it stronger. And it operates with identical logic at the individual level. The professional who has spent the previous 3 years building a genuine external network, not a LinkedIn collection of names, but real relationships characterized by mutual knowledge and demonstrated value, enters a period of industry disruption with an asset that cannot be rapidly constructed once the disruption has begun. The professional who spent those 3 years only executing their current role enters the same disruption with nothing but their current role, which may or may not still exist. The distinction matters enormously because of how professional networks actually function under stress. Research on social capital, particularly the work of sociologist Mark Granovetter on what he called the strength of weak ties, revealed something counterintuitive about how people find opportunities, information, and support during critical professional transitions. The most valuable connections are not your closest relationships. They are the people you know moderately well, former colleagues, industry contacts, people you've collaborated with once or twice, who exist in different professional circles than your immediate network. These weak ties are the bridges between different clusters of information and opportunity, and they are almost entirely invisible during periods of stability, which is precisely why most people neglect to build and maintain them. But here is what makes this finding truly important. Weak ties decay faster than strong ties. A close friendship can survive years of neglect and be revived with a single conversation. A moderate professional relationship, left untended for 2 or 3 years, often dissolves so quietly that neither party notices until one of them needs something. By the time you realize the relationship would have been useful, it is frequently too late to reconstruct it with sufficient depth to be genuinely helpful. The window for building it was years earlier, during the ordinary undramatic periods when nothing in particular seemed to require it. This is the invisible architecture of professional resilience, and it extends far beyond relationships. Consider the role of reputation, not in the superficial sense of being well-liked, but in the deeper sense of being known for something specific and valuable. Reputation is one of the most powerful professional assets a person can possess, and one of the slowest to construct. It is built through consistent demonstration of a specific capability over time in front of the right audiences. It cannot be manufactured quickly. It cannot be acquired in a transaction. It accumulates, the way interest accumulates, through a long series of small deposits made consistently over years. The people who understand this begin making those deposits long before they need to make a withdrawal. They contribute to conversations and projects in ways that demonstrate their specific value, not because an immediate opportunity demands it, but because they are constructing a perception in the minds of the people around them, a perception that will become the foundation of future opportunity. When a role opens, when a project needs leadership, when an organization is looking for someone to trust with something important, that perception is what gets activated. And it was built, quietly and deliberately, long before any of those moments arrived. What is striking is how few people think about reputation as a construction project with a timeline. Most treat it as a byproduct, something that emerges naturally from doing good work. And in a narrow sense, that is true. But the direction of that emergence, the specific shape of the reputation that forms, is far more malleable than most people realize. It is shaped by what you choose to be visible doing, who observes you doing it, and what context surrounds those observations. Leaving that shaping to chance is not a strategy. It is an abdication of one of the most important design decisions in a professional life. There is a particular kind of meeting that takes place in almost every organization at almost every level with remarkable regularity. It is called, in various forms, a strategy session, a planning retreat, a quarterly review. The people in the room are intelligent. They are experienced. They are genuinely trying to make good decisions about the future. And yet, if you observe enough of these meetings across enough organizations, a pattern emerges that is almost impossible to unsee once you have noticed it. The conversation about the future almost always begins with the present. It starts with current performance, current challenges, current resources, and then it projects forward from there, imagining a future that looks like a slightly improved version of now. Faster, bigger, more efficient, but fundamentally continuous with what already exists. This is not strategic thinking, it is extrapolation. And the difference between the two is not semantic. It is the difference between building something genuinely new and simply extending something old. Extrapolation is comfortable because it begins on familiar ground. It uses the concepts, the metrics, the mental models that the organization already possesses. It doesn't require anyone to question whether those models are still adequate for the environment they are actually operating in. Strategic thinking, by contrast, begins with the future and works backward. It asks, given what the world is likely to look like in 5 years, what would we need to have built by then in order to be effective? And then it traces a line from that future requirement back to the present, identifying what needs to be constructed now. Not because now demands it, but because later will. The cognitive difference between these two orientations is subtle but profound, and it has a name in the psychology literature. Researchers distinguish between what they call promotion focus and prevention focus, two motivational orientations that shape how people and organizations approach goals. Prevention focus is oriented around security, around avoiding loss, around maintaining what currently exists. Promotion focus is oriented around growth, around pursuing gains, around moving toward an aspirational future state. Both orientations have their uses. Prevention focus produces caution and thoroughness. Promotion focus produces innovation and risk tolerance. But the critical insight for our purposes is this: building systems before you need them requires a specific combination of both. The foresight to imagine a future state, promotion focus. The discipline to construct carefully and consistently toward it, which borrows from the patience and rigor of prevention focus. Most people default heavily toward one orientation or the other. The people who build invisible edges have learned deliberately to move between them. Consider how this plays out in the specific domain of expertise development. The conventional understanding of expertise is essentially reactive. You need a skill, so you develop it. A job requires a capability, so you acquire it. This model is not wrong, but it is perpetually behind. Because the time required to develop genuine expertise, not surface familiarity, but the deep, reliable, pressure-tested competence that actually creates leverage in a professional environment, is almost always longer than the time available once the need becomes obvious. Cognitive scientists who study skill acquisition generally estimate that developing true proficiency in a complex domain requires somewhere between 3 and 7 years of deliberate practice, not casual exposure, not occasional application. Consistent, intentional, feedback-rich practice directed at the specific mechanisms of performance. This means that if you wait until a skill is obviously necessary before you begin developing it, you will spend the critical period of its necessity operating at a level far below the proficiency you would have had if you had started 3 years earlier. You will be learning under pressure, which is the least efficient learning environment. You will be making mistakes in contexts where mistakes are costly. And you will be competing against people who began the same journey years before you, which means you are perpetually catching up in a race where being current is the minimum requirement, not the advantage. The people with the invisible edge are almost universally early adopters of skill development in their own fields. Not early adopters in the sense of chasing every new trend. That is a different and less useful pattern. Early adopters in the specific sense of identifying, earlier than their peers, which capabilities are likely to become critical in their domain and beginning the long process of genuine development before those capabilities are widely recognized as essential. By the time the skill becomes obviously necessary, they already possess it at a level that took years to build. The gap between them and the people who started developing it only when it became obviously necessary is not a gap of effort or intelligence. It is a gap of timing, and timing in expertise development is almost everything. The organizational theorist Clayton Christensen documented this pattern with devastating clarity in his research on disruptive innovation. The companies that were destroyed by disruptive technologies were almost never destroyed by surprise. The signals were visible, often years in advance. What these companies lacked was not information. It was the organizational will to begin building new capabilities before the existing ones had stopped being profitable. The existing capabilities were still working, still generating revenue, still being rewarded by the current market. And so the investment in new capabilities felt unnecessary, even wasteful, right up until the moment when the disruption made the old capabilities obsolete. At that point, the time required to build the new capabilities was longer than the time the market was willing to wait. The same dynamic operates, with equal precision, in individual careers. The skills that are rewarding you today are the skills that feel least urgent to supplement, which is exactly why supplementing them right now, before their adequacy begins to erode, is the most important professional investment most people are not making. Sometime in the mid-1980s, a young architect named Renzo Piano was working on a project in Paris that most of his contemporaries considered, at best, an interesting experiment and, at worst, a career risk of questionable judgment. The project was a museum, but Piano wasn't approaching it the way architects typically approached museums, as a container for art, a beautiful shell designed to house a predetermined collection in a predetermined way. He was designing what he called a living building, a structure with systems built into its very bones that would allow it to adapt, to reconfigure, to serve purposes that hadn't been fully defined yet, and display art that hadn't been created yet. The mechanical systems were exposed, not hidden. The floor plans were deliberately open rather than fixed. The building was engineered, from its foundation, to change. That building was the Centre Georges Pompidou, and the flexibility Piano built into it before it was needed, flexibility that seemed excessive, even eccentric, to critics at the time, is precisely what has allowed the building to remain one of the most vital and visited cultural institutions in Europe for nearly 5 decades. The capacity Piano built in advance wasn't just architectural. It was a form of institutional foresight embedded in concrete and steel. This idea, building adaptability into the structure of a thing before the need for adaptation becomes apparent, is one of the most sophisticated expressions of the invisible edge. And it applies with remarkable directness to the way individuals construct their professional lives. Most people build their careers the way conventional architects build museums, as containers for a specific function, optimized for what is currently required, with little engineered capacity for reconfiguration. The result is a professional structure that performs beautifully under stable conditions and becomes dangerously rigid the moment conditions change. The alternative is to build what organizational researchers call an ambidextrous professional identity. The term is borrowed from the concept of organizational ambidexterity, the ability of a company to simultaneously exploit current capabilities while exploring new ones. Applied to an individual, it describes someone who has built sufficient depth in their primary domain to be genuinely excellent at what they currently do, while simultaneously maintaining enough breadth and flexibility to pivot, reconfigure, and add new dimensions to their professional identity without starting from zero. Building this kind of ambidexterity is not a matter of spreading yourself thin across too many domains. That is a different mistake, one that produces a collection of shallow competencies rather than a genuinely flexible professional foundation. The architecture of ambidexterity is more specific than that. It involves identifying what researchers call T-shaped skills, a deep vertical bar of genuine expertise in a primary domain, combined with a horizontal bar of working familiarity across adjacent areas. The depth creates credibility and delivers current value. The breadth creates optionality and enables future pivots. What makes this structure genuinely powerful is how the two dimensions interact under conditions of change. When an industry shifts, the person with only vertical depth has one option: go deeper in a domain that may be shrinking. The person with only horizontal breadth has no anchor. They are familiar with many things but genuinely excellent at none of them, which makes them easy to overlook when opportunities require demonstrated mastery. But the person who has built both depth and breadth has a third option, and it is a far more powerful one. They can move laterally from their primary domain into an adjacent one, carrying their depth of expertise with them and applying it in a new context, which creates immediate differentiation because they are bringing genuine mastery to a space where most practitioners are still developing theirs. This lateral move is something the career researchers Herminia Ibarra and Mark Hunter studied extensively in their work on professional reinvention. What they found challenged almost everything the conventional career advice industry tells people about managing professional transitions. The standard advice is to plan the transition carefully, to identify the destination before you leave the origin, to develop a clear narrative before you make the move. Their research found the opposite to be more effective. The most successful professional reinventions were almost always driven by action first and clarity second. People who built adjacent capabilities while still in their current roles discovered their new direction through the process of building, not through planning. The building itself was the exploration. This is a profound insight, and it reframes the entire logic of proactive capacity building. Building before you need something is not only a defensive strategy, a way of protecting yourself against future disruption, it is also a generative strategy. The act of building new capacity changes what you can see. It reveals opportunities that were invisible before you possessed the capability to pursue them. It changes your perception of your own possible futures, not just your preparation for them. There is a concept in philosophy of science called the theory-ladenness of observation. The idea that what you are able to perceive is shaped by the conceptual frameworks you already possess. You cannot see what you have no framework to interpret. The same principle operates in professional life. The opportunities visible to you at any given moment are bounded by the capabilities you currently possess. When you build new capabilities, genuinely through deliberate practice and real application, you expand the perceptual field of your professional life. You begin to see possibilities that were always there but invisible to you before. This is perhaps the most underappreciated benefit of building before you need to. It doesn't just prepare you for a future you can already imagine. It makes visible a future you couldn't have imagined before you began building. In the late 1990s, a behavioral economist named Richard Thaler began working with a colleague named Shlomo Benartzi on a problem that had puzzled retirement researchers for decades. Americans were not saving enough, not because they lacked the intention to save. Survey after survey showed that the vast majority of working adults believed they should be saving more, wanted to save more, and fully intended to save more, starting soon. The gap between intention and behavior was enormous, persistent, and seemingly impervious to education campaigns, financial literacy programs, and even direct financial incentives. People knew what they should do, they simply weren't doing it. Thaler and Benartzi's insight was not to try to change what people wanted. It was to change the structure within which people made their decisions. They designed a program called Save More Tomorrow, which asked employees not to save more now, because now always feels constrained, but to commit in advance to directing a portion of any future salary increase toward retirement savings. The behavioral architecture was elegant in its simplicity. It worked with human psychology rather than against it. It removed the immediate pain of sacrifice by locating the commitment in the future, and it used the automatic enrollment mechanism to make saving the default rather than the exception. The results were dramatic. Participation rates increased substantially. Savings rates climbed significantly over time. People who had been unable to close the gap between intention and behavior for years did so almost effortlessly once the structural conditions were redesigned. Thaler eventually won the Nobel Prize in Economics, partly for this work. But the deeper lesson of Save More Tomorrow is not about retirement savings. It is about the fundamental relationship between systems and behavior, and why the structure of your environment is almost always more powerful than your intentions within it. This is the insight that most self-improvement frameworks miss entirely. They treat behavior change as a matter of motivation, of wanting something badly enough, of summoning sufficient willpower, of maintaining the right mindset. And motivation matters to a point. But motivation is a volatile resource. It fluctuates with mood, with energy, with the competing demands of a complex life. Systems, by contrast, are stable. They operate independently of how you feel on any given morning. They produce consistent output, not because you are consistently inspired, but because the structure itself generates the behavior. The people who build invisible edges are, almost without exception, exceptional designers of their own behavioral environments. They don't rely on motivation to sustain the practices that build their future capacity. They build systems that make those practices the path of least resistance. The protected time for skill development isn't protected by willpower. It is protected by a calendar commitment so consistent and so clearly marked that violating it requires active effort. The relationship maintenance that sustains their professional network isn't driven by spontaneous generosity. It is structured into a regular practice, a systematic rhythm of outreach and engagement that runs whether or not they feel particularly social on any given week. This distinction between relying on motivation and relying on structure is one of the clearest dividing lines between people who consistently build over long periods and people who build in bursts separated by long periods of drift. Bursts of motivated effort produce uneven, fragmented development. Structural consistency produces compounding. And compounding, as we will explore in a moment, is the mechanism that transforms small, consistent investments into disproportionate long-term advantages. But before we get there, it's worth examining a specific cognitive trap that undermines structural consistency for even the most disciplined professionals. Researchers who study habit formation and behavioral change refer to it as the "what the hell" effect, a pattern first documented in studies of dieters but subsequently identified across virtually every domain of self-regulated behavior. The pattern works like this: a person commits to a standard of consistent behavior. They maintain that standard successfully for a period of time. Then they have one bad day. They miss the protected time, skip the practice, neglect the relationship maintenance, and instead of simply returning to the standard the following day, they abandon it entirely. The logic, articulated with remarkable consistency across experimental subjects, runs something like, "I've already broken the streak, so what's the point? I might as well start fresh on Monday." The "what the hell" effect is not a character flaw. It is a predictable response to a specific kind of cognitive framing, one that treats consistency as all or nothing, where any deviation invalidates the entire effort. The antidote is an equally specific reframing, treating the practice not as a streak to be maintained, but as an average to be sustained. A streak must be perfect to survive. An average absorbs variation without collapsing. If your goal is to develop a new capability through consistent practice, one missed session doesn't destroy the effort. It simply becomes part of an overall pattern that remains strongly positive as long as you return quickly. The structural system doesn't require perfection. It requires persistence across imperfection. This is why the most durable professional development systems are almost always designed with what engineers call fault tolerance, the capacity to absorb failures at the component level without system-level collapse. The calendar block that gets occasionally preempted by genuine crisis doesn't invalidate the practice, as long as the block is rescheduled rather than abandoned. The relationship that goes untended for a month doesn't dissolve the network, as long as it is re-engaged before it fully cools. The skill that receives less attention during a high-pressure period doesn't lose its development trajectory, as long as the practice resumes with sufficient regularity on the other side. Building fault-tolerant systems for your own professional development is not a concession to weakness. It is a sophisticated acknowledgement of reality. The conditions of a complex professional life are never going to be ideal. The question is not whether your systems will be disrupted. They will be. The question is whether they are designed to survive disruption and continue producing results across the long arc of a career. That design is not accidental. It is built deliberately in advance by people who understand that the environment will always test what they have constructed, and who build accordingly. There is a mathematical concept that most people encounter in school, nod at politely, and then proceed to dramatically underestimate for the rest of their lives. It is called compound interest. And the reason it is consistently underestimated is not a failure of arithmetic. Most people can perform the calculation correctly when asked. It is a failure of intuition. The human mind, as cognitive scientists have documented extensively, is fundamentally linear in its natural mode of forecasting. We imagine the future as a straight line extending from the present. We expect tomorrow to be slightly better than today, next year to be slightly better than this year, by roughly the same increment each time. Compounding doesn't work that way. It accelerates. Slowly at first, imperceptibly, in ways that feel almost indistinguishable from no progress at all. And then, past a certain threshold, it explodes into results that seem, to anyone who wasn't watching the entire process, almost miraculous. This mathematical reality has a direct and underappreciated parallel in professional development. The systems you build, the skills you develop, the relationships you cultivate, the reputation you construct, the operational capacity you create, do not produce linear returns. They compound. Each increment of capability makes the next increment easier to develop, because you have more context, more pattern recognition, more foundational knowledge to build upon. Each relationship in a professional network increases the value of every other relationship, because networks derive their power from connectivity, from the bridging function that each node performs between the other nodes around it. Each increment of reputation makes the next increment more credible, because trust, once established, extends naturally into adjacent domains. The compounding of professional systems is why the people who begin building early and consistently arrive 10 or 15 years later at positions of advantage that seem wildly disproportionate to the difference in effort between them and their peers. It is not that they worked dramatically harder. It is that they started earlier, sustained their building through the long period when the returns were invisible, and allowed the compounding mechanism to do what it does when given sufficient time, produce results that cannot be replicated quickly, regardless of how much effort is subsequently applied. Warren Buffett, whose career is perhaps the most extensively analyzed example of compounding in action, has noted on multiple occasions that the vast majority of his wealth was accumulated after his 50th birthday, despite the fact that he had been investing successfully since he was a teenager. The first several decades of compounding produced results that were impressive by ordinary standards, but not obviously extraordinary. The extraordinary results arrived later, as the accumulated base grew large enough for even modest percentage returns to generate enormous absolute gains. His edge was not primarily analytical. Many investors have possessed comparable analytical ability. His edge was temporal. He started earlier, sustained longer, and allowed the compounding mechanism to operate across a time horizon that most investors never commit to. The professional parallel is direct. The person who begins building genuine expertise at 25 and sustains that building consistently through their 30s and 40s arrives at 50 with a depth and texture of capability that simply cannot be replicated by someone who begins the same journey at 40, regardless of how intensely they pursue it. The time itself is the ingredient that cannot be substituted. And this is why the decision to begin building, not someday, not when conditions are more favorable, not after the current crisis has resolved, is always more consequential than it appears in the moment of making it. But there is a specific dimension of professional compounding that receives almost no attention in the literature on career development. And it is perhaps the most powerful of all. It is the compounding of judgment. Every decision you make, every project you lead, every crisis you navigate, every negotiation you conduct adds a layer of experiential data to the decision-making architecture of your mind. Over time, this accumulation of experience produces what researchers who study expert judgment call tacit knowledge, a form of knowing that cannot be fully articulated, cannot be transferred through instruction, and cannot be acquired through any means other than sustained experience in a relevant domain. Tacit knowledge is what allows the seasoned executive to walk into a troubled organization and sense within hours the nature of the dysfunction, not because they have performed a formal analysis, but because the pattern feels familiar in a way that draws on decades of accumulated organizational experience. It is what allows the experienced investor to recognize the specific texture of a market top, the particular combination of sentiment, valuation, and narrative that has preceded corrections before, even when the current situation is superficially different from any previous one. It is what allows the veteran negotiator to read the room in ways that younger counterparts, however intelligent, simply cannot, because reading a room accurately requires a perceptual library built from hundreds of previous rooms. This form of compounding is invisible precisely because it operates beneath the level of conscious articulation. You cannot point to it on a resume. You cannot demonstrate it in a job interview with the same clarity that you can demonstrate technical skills or strategic frameworks. But in the actual practice of professional life, in the moments that matter most, under the conditions of genuine pressure and genuine complexity, it is frequently the decisive factor, and it accumulates only through deliberate engagement with the full complexity of professional experience over long periods of time. Which means that the person who consistently seeks out challenging, complex, high-stakes situations, not because they are comfortable, but because they are building, arrives at each successive stage of their career with a depth of judgment that their peers, who spent the same years in safer and more comfortable roles, simply do not possess. The compounding of judgment, the compounding of relationships, the compounding of expertise, the compounding of reputation. These are the mechanisms through which the invisible edge becomes, over time, an insurmountable advantage. Not because the person who built it is fundamentally different from anyone else, but because they started earlier, sustained longer, and trusted a process whose returns were invisible for years before they became undeniable. There is a final pattern worth examining, the one that ties everything together, and it is in some ways the most counterintuitive of all, because it suggests that the invisible edge is not ultimately about preparation in the conventional sense. It is not about being ready for specific scenarios or having contingency plans for identifiable risks or developing particular skills for foreseeable opportunities. It is about something deeper and more fundamental than any of those things. It is about the relationship between a person and uncertainty itself. Most people experience uncertainty as a problem to be solved, a gap between what is known and what needs to be known, a space of discomfort to be crossed as quickly as possible on the way to the solid ground of clarity. And because uncertainty feels like a problem, they respond to it the way people respond to most problems. They try to eliminate it. They seek more information. They wait for more data. They defer decisions until the picture is clearer. They postpone building until they can see more precisely what they should be building toward. This response is understandable. It is also, in the context of a genuinely complex and dynamic professional environment, almost perfectly counterproductive. Because the kind of uncertainty that characterizes modern professional life, the uncertainty of technological change, of organizational transformation, of shifting market conditions and evolving social dynamics, is not the kind that resolves itself with more information and more waiting. It is structural uncertainty. It is a permanent feature of the landscape, not a temporary condition that precedes clarity. Waiting for it to lift is not a strategy. It is a way of standing still while the world moves. The people who build invisible edges have made a specific and consequential peace with this reality. They have stopped trying to eliminate uncertainty before they act, and started building in ways that make them more capable of navigating uncertainty regardless of its specific form. This is the distinction between risk management, which tries to identify and mitigate specific known risks, and what the strategist Roger Martin calls the management of uncertainty itself, which builds the generic capacity to respond effectively to whatever form the unexpected takes. Consider how this plays out in the domain of decision-making. Research on high-performing leaders across industries consistently shows that the most effective decision-makers are not the ones who gather the most information before deciding. They are the ones who have developed the clearest frameworks for making decisions with incomplete information, and who have built, through experience, the confidence to act on those frameworks without waiting for certainty that will never arrive. Their edge is not informational, it is architectural. They have built a decision-making system that functions effectively under conditions of genuine uncertainty, because they have tested and refined that system across hundreds of previous decisions made under similar conditions. This is what the philosopher of science Karl Popper called living with uncertainty, not as a form of intellectual surrender, but as the highest expression of intellectual honesty. The person who pretends to certainty they do not possess makes decisions that feel confident, but are actually fragile, because they are built on foundations that cannot support the weight of the real world's complexity. The person who has made peace with uncertainty makes decisions that feel uncomfortable, but are actually robust, because they are designed from the outset to function in a world that will not behave exactly as predicted. Building systems before you need them is, at its deepest level, an expression of this relationship with uncertainty. It says, I do not know exactly what the future will demand of me. I cannot predict with precision which skills will matter most, which relationships will prove critical, which capabilities will become the difference between thriving and merely surviving. But I know that the future will demand something. I know that complexity will arrive. I know that pressure will test whatever I have built. And so I will build broadly, deeply, and consistently, not toward a specific predicted future, but toward a general condition of greater capability, greater resilience, and greater optionality than I currently possess. This is the mindset of the architect, rather than the tactician. The tactician optimizes for the current configuration of the battlefield. The architect designs structures that will function across multiple possible configurations. Both roles are necessary, but the architect's work is what endures. It is what remains useful when the battlefield changes shape, which it always does, on a timeline that nobody can predict with precision and everybody eventually experiences. There is a phrase that the venture capitalist Mark Andreessen has used in various contexts to describe what separates the founders who build lasting companies from those who build successful ones that ultimately plateau: strong views, loosely held. The strong views provide direction, conviction, the willingness to act before certainty arrives. The loose holding provides the flexibility to update, to reconfigure, to abandon a specific path without abandoning the underlying commitment to building. Applied to the construction of a professional life, this phrase captures something essential. Build with conviction, build consistently, build before you need to, but hold the specific form of what you are building loosely enough to let experience and observation shape it as you go. Because the invisible edge is never finished. It is not a destination you arrive at and then protect. It is a practice, a continuous, deliberate, forward-oriented orientation toward your own professional development and the systems that support it. The people who possess it most fully are not the ones who built the most impressive structure at some point in the past. They are the ones who are still building now, today, in the ordinary and undramatic present, adding to what they have, refining what exists, extending capacity in directions that the future has not yet made obviously necessary. That quiet, consistent, forward-oriented building is the invisible edge, and the moment to begin it, as it has always been for everyone who eventually looked back and understood this, is before you need it. There is something worth sitting with, now that we have traveled the full length of this idea together. At no point in this journey did we encounter a secret. There was no hidden technique available only to a fortunate few. No proprietary framework accessible only to those with the right connections or the right credentials. Everything we explored, the margins of safety, the dual timelines, the compounding of judgment, the architecture of resilience, the peace made with uncertainty, These are not rare discoveries. They are patterns visible to anyone who looks carefully at the lives of people who build lasting success. They have always been visible. They are hiding, as the best insights tend to, entirely in plain sight. What makes them rare in practice is not their complexity, it is their relationship with time. Every principle we explored shares the same fundamental challenge. The returns are delayed and the investment is immediate. You build the relationship before you need it. You develop the skill before it is required. You construct the system before the crisis arrives. You make the deposits before you need to make the withdrawal. In a world organized around immediate feedback, immediate reward, and immediate validation, this kind of forward-oriented building asks something genuinely difficult of the people who attempt it. It asks for trust in a process whose results are, for long stretches, completely invisible. That invisibility is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Because the invisibility is precisely what creates the edge. If the returns were immediate and obvious, everyone would do it. Everyone would build the margins, cultivate the networks, develop the adjacent capabilities, and design the fault-tolerant systems. The advantage would evaporate in the competition of universal adoption. It is the delay, the long, quiet, unrewarded period of building before the building pays off, that filters out everyone who is not genuinely committed to the long game. The invisible edge belongs ultimately to the people who are willing to work in the dark, building things whose value won't be apparent for years, sustained by an understanding of compounding that their present circumstances do nothing to confirm. This is not a comfortable place to operate from. It requires a specific kind of internal conviction, a confidence in the logic of the process that does not depend on external validation to sustain itself. That conviction is itself a system, and like every other system we explored, it is built deliberately, through the accumulation of small decisions made consistently over time, each one a quiet reaffirmation of the belief that what you build before you need it will matter most when you need it most. You now know what the invisible edge is. You understand how it is built, why it compounds, and what it costs in patience and forward vision to construct it. What happens next is entirely yours to determine. The building begins not with a dramatic decision or a sweeping reorganization of your professional life. It begins with the next small choice, the next protected hour, the next relationship tended, the next capability extended, just slightly beyond where it currently reaches. It begins as all durable things begin, quietly. And it begins now.